Good afternoon, everyone. This is Henry getting the chart patterns breakout session started with you today. We'll run through a quick audio and video check. And once I can confirm everything is good to go, we'll get into our conversation today. So good to see Amirza and Lorna. Thank you guys for confirming the tech side of things. Looks like everything is streaming where it needs to be. And with that, we will get our conversation underway. So, when we talk about chart patterns, what is a chart pattern? While this may seem simple enough, it's a good place to start. A chart pattern is a formation created by the movement of a security's price plotted on an X and Y axis that traders use to identify patterns and trends and use that to make trading decisions. Chart patterns are worth studying because they reflect all known information about a company, all of its earnings misses and beats, the good news and the bad, considerations around the macroeconomic environment. It's all here. Every bit of that information is reflected in these bars or candles that we call a stock chart. For today's discussion, I'm going to focus on bar charts and the patterns that I try to identify inside of them. I also enjoy using candlesticks, and you could probably use them in the same way that we're going to use bar charts, but they really are a different field of study and can, sometimes make the other patterns a little bit more difficult to recognize. So for that reason, I have just the pretty standard bar chart that you see on your left there. And that's what we'll be going through our discussion with today. But as a human, you have the unique ability to perceive patterns. It's something that can be learned and something that can be enhanced, but everyone has this ability to some degree. Your ability to discern patterns is often going to be better than that of a machine. We can still use machines to help us narrow our focus, to do a bit of the heavy lifting for us, but ultimately these patterns are something that you're going to want to be able to identify on your own and discern the nuances of. There are two primary ways that I scan for chart patterns. Thinkorswim is one we'll look at first. Their tools are free with any funded brokerage account and is a fairly popular and common platform. The other that I use is PatternFinder from CML Labs. For those of you that have followed myself or Simpler Trading for a while now, are probably familiar with Ophir and the work that he's done with Trade Machine and CML Pro. This PatternFinder is his latest creation, and if chart patterns are your thing, it's just one more helpful resource. So with that, let's dive into some Thinkorswim chart patterns. The first thing we're going to look at is scanning for patterns. I like the workflow of scanning for potential patterns first, then I can lay eyes on them and verify the pattern when we move over to a chart. I'm going to assume that if you're familiar with Thinkorswim, you're at least somewhat familiar with their scanning functionality. So we'll start by moving to that section of the platform, removing all of the existing scan criteria, and then click Add Filter and then Pattern. So in these slides, and of course we're going to do some of this live as well, but the idea is that if you're just using the slides, you have this numbered progression where you will start by adding a filter. We're going to go down to the bottom of that list where you find Pattern. And then once you've got that added, we can now click on the drop down that will show up here next to it to see all of the available patterns. We're not going to cover every pattern on here in today's discussion. Instead, we're really going to focus on really just one of them, a couple of its settings, how to put it onto a chart, and then the remaining patterns will all be very similar, right? So starting here with the ascending triangle, after clicking on Edit, we can see that we have two tabs with parameters and sensitivity. So again here, top left, parameters. The pattern length is where we'll specify the lower and upper limits in bars of the time periods on which this pattern needs to be identified. For direction, a lot of this stuff is relatively self-explanatory, but this is for the direction that we are anticipating the trend to move after completion, right? Bullish, bearish, or both. Then we have trend, where we can specify whether the pattern should continue or reverse the preceding trend. And then breakout, where we can specify whether we're looking for a breakout that is already completed, one that is emerging, or scan for both. You can then move over to the sensitivity tab, where you can drag these sliders to specify the initial trend, which, again, as it sounds, will define the strength of the preceding trend, the breakout strength, volume increase, the uniformity, and the clarity. So these are options in each of these scanning fields. For most of what I do, I leave them all on the weak side. My experience has been that the more that you get into to really, telling it to finesse these patterns, it really narrows down the results almost to the point of getting none. So I leave the machine part of this as lenient as possible, and then I do a lot of the, refining my idea once this scan has found it for me. So we'll get all of those set, and then we'll move over to our time frame. So the next piece of criteria is here just to the right of that ascending triangle pattern that we've already selected. And what we're specifying in this first drop down is how much data we're pulling. How far back in time would you like to look for these patterns, essentially? Once you've selected how much data you want to look at, you can then customize the aggregation inside that. For 1 year, it will be locked to daily, and this is generally where I focus my efforts. Though if you want to take this and drill down into smaller time frames, of course you can, but I really enjoy pattern thinking in general, just on bigger time frames, so daily, weekly, etc. As we see here, with a year of daily scanning for loose or lenient ascending triangles that offer weekly options, we're given a list of 146 stocks. So that's also worth noting here is that not only, and I actually clipped it off of the image, unfortunately, but not only am I just scanning for ascending triangles, but that additional piece of criteria, and we'll look at it in the platform once we're done with the slides, but you can add other filter criteria, and I find that weekly watch list, or the weekly options one, to be very helpful. So again, this is just that ascending triangle with lenient settings against anything that is going to have a weekly option. So once we've got these results, I like to sort by volume, or in this case, as I was going through the results, I actually saw a name that stood out to me because I've been following it for other pieces of analysis. So I see, okay, JP Morgan has this ascending triangle. I've been covering financials in the evening newsletter, and I also know that it's a critical part of the market. So now that we've got a pattern that may have some importance, and a pattern, or a name that's important, a pattern that is coming up for us, let's move over to a chart. So once we've got this, again, just your very clean bar chart, we're going to go up into the top right-hand corner where you'll see patterns. Once we select that, the bottom drop-down menu is to select your patterns. So all of this is going to be very similar as to what we saw in the scanner. We're going to do the same thing by selecting the ascending triangle and then just making sure that whatever settings you have set in the scanner also match in the chart settings to make sure that you're seeing what you're supposed to. But once we have those settings both matched up, we'll apply that, and then we'll start to see these patterns revealed on the chart. So now we can visually see this ascending triangle that the scanner was alerting us to, and we can start to build a trade idea from there. The basic implications of the ascending triangle are that resistance is the upper horizontal, and while this area that has been finding distribution keeps a lid on price, when price retreats, it makes a better low. So essentially, here's one of those lows. Here's a better low. Here's yet again a better low. And it's the idea that once you eventually push up through the area of resistance, because these better lows can only build for so long until they finally push you up through the area that has been sold. So after you push up through the horizontal, and there are then, two primary ways of assessing your target, one of which is a measured move, which would just take the 144 swing high. You would measure that range, duplicate that drawing, and then project it to create, essentially this is the range you're breaking out from. So to find a similar range up, through the breakout is one way you can project those targets. And then the other way that you can do it is to use Fibonacci proportion to take the previous swing high against the swing low, and then measure for the 1272, the 1618, and that's how you can project where price may be moving out of these technical patterns. So once I've found a pattern that I like, I'll put it into the opposing platform, which is to say if I found it through Thinkorswim, I'll run it through PatternFinder, through CML. If I find something here, I want to see what the Thinkorswim side of it gets, because each of these platforms is not going to recognize pattern exactly the same. In the case of PatternFinder here, we can see that our default look back period is 18 months. So they're using just a little bit more data than what we were doing in Thinkorswim, but it is still analyzing the daily aggregation. And I thought that this was an interesting comparison because we see a similar pattern, but the additional data, the going out the plus 6 months to give us the 18-month look back, shows us an anchor point that is further back in time and potentially giving us a larger pattern to play inside the smaller one. It's a sort of nested ascending triangle, if you will, because this is your 18-month anchor period. Obviously, you can see the trend line that's also building up from the lower end. And if you break out of that, the implications would be, that there's a larger breakout going on inside of the smaller one. So that's kind of interesting. That's current with the current market and part of what came up in that. So what else was in that list of all of these results? If we go back to that Thinkorswim scan and go through a few more of these, we can see more of what the scanner is actually providing us, because these names will not always be immediately actionable patterns. The JP Morgan ascending triangle is absolutely currently in play, right? I mean, that's what they're sitting there waiting to see if it's going to break out. But what it'll do is give you a list of all of those that show this pattern for the amount of data that you've looked at. So again, we set this up off of a 52-week look back period using daily aggregation. So we make sure that our chart is looking at 1 year of daily bars, and then you see this same thing where Thinkorswim just draws in, here's the horizontal, here are the better lows that it continued to make, and then you can see the breakout of that pattern. So, it's doing what it's supposed to. It's showing you, kind of how these should resolve. These are also really unique because if you think back to this Google example, you'll remember that it was accompanied with a daily squeeze. So it's a way of taking a chart pattern with a technical signal, and you can see the results. I tell you that because, again, JP Morgan is in the ascending triangle. It has a daily squeeze that is still in play, and that's part of how I work to find my trade ideas. Another one of these showing you in CSCO. These are several of the past ascending triangles. And one thing that's a little quirky is what I have found inside Thinkorswim charting is that it tries to, and I have it set to default, that in the patterns that it projects you the profit target area, right? Like this one is perfect because let me give you a rectangle to highlight this. But here you can see where it builds into this ascending triangle pattern, and then it helps plot out what it's looking for in the way of targets. I told you you can do measured moves or Fibonacci relationships. but the indicator will try to plot out these target areas. So that's what you're seeing in here, and just again, past recognition. It's uh, 3 or 4 examples, depending on exactly how you'd like to count it, for that past 52 week of daily bars, but not really much in the way of a current forming pattern. So that's essentially what I've been using inside this pattern scanning, and then the rest of this I was going to do live with you. So it's essentially coming into here and just a few small little tips on navigating this. So doing that same thing and telling you, let's just kind of start from scratch here and let's work through a few patterns, because once you know how to use it with everything we've covered in the ascending triangle, it's going to be exactly the same process for any pattern you want to look at. So let's take this, we're going to add a filter, we're going to add a pattern. Let's do that same thing, but just let's do both. Actually, I can show this to you 2 ways. We'll just do descending triangles for now. We'll go back into these settings. I've been moving this down to 5, again, just to give myself a few more results, making sure that that sensitivity is all the way over on the most lenient parameters. And then we'll click apply. And then this is where I give you, because see, if you just hit scan with that alone, okay, we've got 82, which is actually a fairly limited result. That's actually a number we can work with. But if we want to narrow our focus a little bit further, this is where these drop downs are so helpful, because the intersect with is where I was telling you that you'll come down into public. It is the last available watch list, and this is weeklies. What that means is anything inside this is going to offer a weekly option instead of just a monthly, which is huge if you're an active trader. So now that we've added that weekly drop down, let's see what it narrows down the 82 from. Okay, and now it drops us to 25. So that's what I'm talking about when you've got to do some visual and some legwork yourself on this, but the machine part that can help filter this down for us, all right, now we've got this list of 25 descending triangles that showed up in these charts over the course of the past. And actually, I did my time frames wrong. Let me go back to the 1 year daily as we were discussing. And now what I will do is go over here. You see the small little gear here on the right hand side. So when you go into this and customize, you can find the option, because you can't directly link scan results to the chart linking, but what you can do is go over to that little gear and add in this send to, and I have mine linked for the number 3 or blue, and then you see how it gives you this column. Okay, so now that I've got that added into my scan results, I will move this over to another monitor. I will pull up the chart that is linked to that same number 3. And then we want to do the same thing with patterns. So we'll go into select patterns. We want to go, we did a descending triangle, was the scan that we just ran. So we'll add that to our charts. Click OK. And now you can go through, and the first result I see is Tesla. So I'm just going to click on the 3. That'll move it over to it. I'm not sure where the Tesla one I'm missing. Let's look at another example here with AT&T. So this one's way back here on the far left-hand side of the chart. There's some interesting ones in Apple. And the thing about this is that it's working to reveal patterns that you might not otherwise see. While, of course, this descending triangle example in Apple is well from the past, it helps emphasize the point that here's your horizontal, and here are continuously worse lows, worse highs. So the idea is that if you can't break above that, eventually it'll get below, and there's your break of the descending triangle. So, what are other patterns that traders may find interesting in here? I ran a few of these, and what I found was interesting, like if we do the head and shoulders, Let's see if it gives us the same type of results here. So I'm going to move into Head and Shoulders. I'm going to edit this one, again, for a little more lenience. And I want to look at them that are only bearish. Apply that and scan. Let's see what these look like. Because what I had been seeing is that so many of these that showed up with head and shoulder patterns actually ended up being more bullish. And you always find that in markets where it's just like naturally a bull market, that, you know, bearish signals like that tend to reverse more often. And that's, you know, a big part of what I was seeing in here. Let me get this back to apply. So here's another, right? This is some of the past history of plug. And there's highlighting the profit zone if you were to be short. Now other settings inside of these, so like what I was telling you, if you go to patterns, man, S&P's popping here. Also keeping an eye on where the markets are going to head into the end of the day. I'm tracking SPY into 430. You know, talk about patterns. How about that squeeze pattern on the daily chart of the spiders? But, you know, it's a big part of what is driving a lot of this action. But, let's see. That's most of what I was gonna go through on those slides. But again, that's kind of what I've got for this, guys. And a little bit of what I've got left from there, I leave it to you a little bit. The focus of today's conversation was just these classic, right? Because once you can identify them, you put them on the chart, and then, you know, through those scanning, it'll help you narrow down your focus a little bit faster. I think in some of the future ones, we may get into more of the candlestick and Fibonacci, but otherwise, that's probably where I will leave things. I'll wrap up the recording there. If you do have any other questions, comments, or otherwise, I have included one page of additional resources. So if you go to this link, it'll give you a direct path to more of the settings that we've already covered. But if you want to kind of sit down and have that manual in front of you to work through this, that can be a helpful resource. And then if you do have any other, you know, things that showed up in this that you had questions, comments on, or otherwise, I did leave my contact information there for you at the bottom. So I hope that gave you a little bit of help in searching for tradable patterns. Again, filtering them down in Thinkorswim, putting them onto a chart, and that's kind of the basics of that recognition. So you guys have a great rest of your Friday, a great close and a good weekend, and I hope to see you back in here next week.